In this video we're taking a deep dive into the preset that I created to make this kick. This is an entire kick made out of just one instance of Serum 2, so stick around to learn how to make full kicks in Serum 2, and I'll share lots of tips and tricks which you can use to improve your kicks. Full kick in Serum 2, we're going to use oscillator A and B for the punch and the sub and C oscillator for the tail. I'll just take away all the effects from the chain over here, and we'll take away the filters as well so I can show you what's happening in the oscillator section. As you're hearing, you'll hear the punch first and then the tail separate, and we're doing that by using these two envelopes on the level of the separate oscillators. Now what I do recommend is that you start with either the punch or the tail when you're going to create a full kick inside of Serum, just to make sure that it's not too overwhelming and you're doing multiple things at the same time. And personally, I started with the punch. So for the punch, I'm taking an LFO1 on the envelope mode, and I'm putting this on the semitones so that we can create a downwards pitching envelope basically, before pushing this through some distortion. And then it sounds like this. So we're having this basic punch sound, but we do need to shape this further. And what we're doing is we're using filter 1 on A and B, and I'm using LFO1 on the cutoff and the resonance as well to create more movement to perfect the transient of that punch. When the distortion was there, I wanted to change the sound up a little bit, so first I added an equalizer, and with this equalizer, if you put a low cut and then play around a little bit with the Q, then you can play around with the phasing of that lows before the distortion and change up the sound of the punch basically. And I added a little bit of a peak with some movement again from LFO1. And then I added a hyperdimension. This is probably going to make more of a change when the tail comes in as well, but this changes the phasing, adds a little bit of unison and stereo before the distortion, so it changes the whole sound again. Now let's bring in the tail. For these tail layers, we are also using a filter. Again, I'm using LN12, and I'm using the peak and the resonance and the frequency basically to get the right tone for that tail. Now, because we're distorting the punch, we're actually making that punch a little bit longer. So the decay time on envelope 2 is 230 milliseconds, but because of the distortion, the punch becomes a little bit longer. So for our envelope 3, we can do that a little bit later at around 250, because that punch is a little bit longer. So you don't need to put this envelope at exactly the end of your decay time of the punch. Now for the tail, to create the movement, we're using LFO2 and we're putting that on the wavetable position. This wavetable position just plays through the wavetable, and that creates the growling sound of this tail. Because if we don't have it on there, it's still sounding fine, but it lacks movement. After my distortion, I often like to add a filter. I like to go for flanger or chrome filters because they're often quite intense with all the dips and the peaks, but it's also why we need to be careful. Especially if we turn up the mix, because then it's going through this filter all the way. And that's not the sound that we want. So what we do want is that we add a distortion after this again, so then it becomes distorted. And then it stays nice and loud. Then I added another EQ. And this was just to boost some bass before this final distortion. And that's basically how you can create a full kick inside of Serum 2. I'll now focus a little bit on beginner level kind of layering and finishing of a kick. As a beginner, you don't need to finish your kicks as properly as possible, but you can just easily use them in a track and just play around with them. What I did in this case is I split the punch and the tail. We went into the mixer, and as you can see, I split them into different mixer channels. And in here, I boosted the bass, got some low mids because that was necessary, and we did this with a linear phase EQ. And for the punch, we add a little bit of compression and some EQ where we take away again some of these low mids and a little bit of these highs. We add them because it just gives some more transient to it. And these small tweaks make the kick go from this to this. So the punch is already a little bit more snappy, and that's good. Then what I always like to do is add a little bit of punch reverb. So I have my reverb send basically over here, and I'm sending my punch through there, recording that reverb, and then we get this reverb hit. and I just add this automation on the volume so that it has a nice drive. Then if we layer all these three sounds together, we can still finish that off with a little bit of a inflator, and this inflator is just nice to add more loudness. So you're noticing that when I pull this down, it's just a little bit more, you could say transparent, it's a little bit more thin. And with the curve up, it just pushes it a little bit more in those lower frequencies. And that's how you can easily adjust this kick and make it sound nice. Now to take this kick to the next level, we can edit it further, of course, with more layers in the punch and the till. Let me show you how I did that. As we can see from this punch here is that there is actually no low end in there, and often you want a little bit of lows in your punch. So if we keep focusing on the punch for now, we can add a club kick, for example, and take away the transient so that we have this low end rumble basically that we can put underneath our punch. And if we play around with the phasing of that a little bit, like with the pogo and a little bit of pitching, then you can make sure that this aligns properly with the punch. Let me show you what I mean. Do you see how that body of the entire punch changes? You want to play around with that until you get something that fits properly. Also, in the mixer channels, I pulled this down quite low so that it's not overtaking the punch itself. Then I added this clap. This clap is heavily edited with some EQ, like this, and distortion to make it more full and distorted and fitting with the rest of our punch. Again, we can play around with the pitch and the pogo to make sure that this fits properly with our punch. But then we go from this to this. Now for the tail it's quite easy. We're adding this extra sub layer, and this is just a sine wave with some noise that's being distorted. Literally a sine wave with alpha noise and a little bit of tube distortion. And we export that and put that underneath our tail. You want to make sure that the phasing is correct, so that it's not like this, because then the low end will cancel out. But we want to make sure that it's a little bit in the same spot. So you can always make it a little bit like this, so it's a little bit off, or a little bit in this direction, a little bit off, that's fine too. But you want to make sure that the low end is aligning properly, where the positives go in the same direction of both waveforms and the negative go in the same direction as well. Adding this extra sub waveform makes sure that this still is so much more full. As you can see on this kick tail and the extra sub, we don't even do any extra effects, and on the tail bus we just add a little bit of EQ where we take away some of the low mids, and then we route this to one kick bus where we again take away some low mids and finish this off with another inflator, and that finishes this kick. Make sure to check the download link in the description, as this project file is free, and if you have any questions, drop them in the comments. And if you need any help with your music, you want some private classes, or need me to help you out with some sound design, you can also check out the Fiverr link in the description. Thank you for your attention, and cheers!